Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today I'm going to be reviewing Ultimate Railroads. This is a giant compilation of all the games, starting with Russian Railroads, including all the expansions, published by Z-Man Games, and designed by Helmut Oli and Leonard Ergler. Alright, so here is a game of Russian Railroads, all set up for solo. So there are a bunch of different expansions in the box, but Russian Railroads is the original. It's the simplest version of the game, so that's the one I chose to set up. And I recommend that if you do play this, that you start with just plain old Russian Railroads. And it is great just in its base form. But this is set up for solo. And if you've never played Russian Railroads before at all, basically what you're doing is you are playing a worker placement game where you are going to advance your tracks, and there are different tracks that you can advance. You're going to power your locomotives so that you can go further down those tracks. And then you're also going to push up this industry track. So when you get locomotives, if you flip them to the other side, they're also factories. So you're able to get yourself little bonuses along the way, depending on whether you use the locomotive to power your train further down the track or flip it over to a factory side, put it in your industry, and get the bonuses that are on those tiles. But what makes the game interesting is that you have to advance certain kinds of track and then upgrade. So you have this base track that's not really worth any points, but you have to advance it out to certain distances along this railroad in order to unlock the tracks that do score you something. So for example, here, this plain neutral colored track, if you get it to space 2, you unlock your greens, which are worth some points. So if you look here, when you score, greens are worth 1 point per track they're out. This copper color is worth 2, silver 4, and then the fancy big gold one is 7, but you have to get all the way out here and then also be advancing that track. And then of course, building the track isn't enough. You do actually have to run trains on it. So you start with just this one little locomotive, but then you have to purchase higher value ones as the game goes on. And then I don't know why Emil ended up here, but we're going to talk about him in a moment. If you look at the spaces on this board, basically these are just different spots you can go to try to achieve those goals. So if you want to advance tracks, you come here. If you want to get locomotives or factories, you'll come here. If you want to advance your industry track and score for it, you come here. And then these are doublers that increase the value of the spaces scored on this top track. You score at the end of every round, and your first score is always going to be kind of puny, but by the end of 6 rounds, your score is huge. The way that you track rounds is with these engineers, who are also cool because when you purchase them, which you can purchase 1 per turn, they give you some pretty sweet bonuses, including victory points. Just your own personal action in general is great. And they give you cheaper and better ways to advance your tracks. So the engineers are also pretty awesome and worth considering. And then as you advance your tracks, you'll notice there's a whole bunch of different little bonuses that pop up. You can get extra workers. These little tokens here are basically rewards where you can pick one and then place it here to show that you got that reward. And then this is a special scoring bonus. There are also keys on here that when reached allow you to perform a special action, which is detailed here in the middle of the board. This game is a relatively simple game, but at the same time it's brutal because you're going to be fighting over spaces on the board. And in a multiplayer game of Russian Railroads, that can get absolutely vicious in a really good way. If you're playing solo, what happens is that you play against Emil, who is an automated opponent who doesn't actually score points or do anything in particular except block spaces. So when you are playing the solo version of Russian Railroads or any of its expansions, you're using Emil's deck. You are setting up the same way basically every time. You give him some workers. You put some workers here for when you hit certain scoring thresholds, because when you do, he will. And so Emil has no real resource management or anything, just the cards that he will use to block off spaces. One of the rules, in fact, for using Emil is that he can only go to spaces where he will block you. So if he draws a space that you can't even do anything with yet, you're supposed to skip that card and keep going until you can get something he'll do that's actually irritating, because it's the space you had access to. So for example, here, if we flip this card over, we see that this is the pay 2 workers to move 3 green tracks. So if we have access to green tracks, then he will come over here and block us from moving them, even though he's not going to move any tracks himself. And on his turn, you'll just keep working through his deck. So for example, if I've already gone to this space, then he'll skip this and draw another card until he goes somewhere that is actually irritating to me. And that's basically how Emil works. He's very, very simple, not at all a difficult AI to run. And he's really just there to allow you to play this game against yourself because it's your high score that's going to count for the most every time. So that's a very, very basic overview of Russian Railroads. And if you want to add more from the expansions, that's entirely possible. So German Railroads gives you some more track options. There's like a coal expansion that adds a different kind of action to the game. The American version has stock markets. And then the Asian Railroads lets you get these crazy high scores with some of the stuff that they add into that module. So that's my brief overview. Let's go ahead and go into some final thoughts. All right, so now for some final thoughts. When I saw Ultimate Railroads in the store, I bought it immediately. I wanted it so bad. I've played Russian Railroads at game night, and I loved it. I really, really love this game in groups. And so I could not wait to get my hands on it so I could solo it at home and try out all the expansions. Like, my excitement for this was big. And I'm just going to be blunt, maybe it shouldn't have been. And it's not because the game itself isn't great. I absolutely stand by my opinion that Russian Railroads is awesome. And, it's really just great to play with other people. With other people, it's very dramatic. All the worker placements seem extremely important, moment to moment. The competition's really fierce. It's a very intense game to play. And so I really like this game with other people. I did not like the solo. And honestly, a lot of that is probably that times have changed. Solo modes have really changed. I looked up German Railroads, and it was released in 2015. And there were pretty good solo games around at that time. But not all games with solo modes were to the standards that I think a lot of solo gamers have now. So the Emil deck is not terrible. It's simple to operate. But basically, Emil blocks spaces without scoring any points. So you're really just competing against yourself every time. And Emil is just kind of a lackluster opponent. Especially, if you just have to keep going through the deck until there's something Emil can do, because maybe you've taken up a lot of spaces already. Or, you just keep drawing stuff that doesn't really apply to that moment. Dealing with Emil is a mixture of easy and tedious. And I never really felt any tension when I was playing solo Ultimate Railroads. All of the real thrill and snap that comes from the game, in my experience, has come from playing it with other people. And it's fun to try to generate a high score, but it's way more fun to do that when you are fighting with somebody else. The AI in this particular game just doesn't put up enough of a fight for me. And, makes too many decisions that are either a little too perfect or totally not, depending on, just the random draw of the deck. So even your high scores aren't really about how skillfully you played necessarily once you get to a certain level in the game. It's more about just, how optimally did Emil play? And if you are kind of in that space, then it's just not as good. It's just not as good. And I think that there are much, much better solo modes for Euro games, for worker placement games coming out in our more modern era of 2022 than were available in 2015. So you can't really blame that solo mode for being what it is in its time. But I also think that maybe for this reprint, it would have been wise to think a little harder about it instead of just reprint it straight up and just throw it out there into the world. And there were some other issues that I had with this particular edition. There were some issues in the rulebook with its printing where you could tell that the typing was sloppy. Some of the changes that were made from the original Russian Railroads I thought were aesthetically displeasing. So the base black track markers that you use to lay track are now replaced with a neutral color, and then the gray ones are replaced with green. And it was just super mind-bending and weird to adjust to in a way that I didn't really think was necessary and didn't like, frankly. So I guess what it boils down to is I went and blew $110 on this game of my personal money because I wanted it so bad to play this solo. And I regret that choice. I mean, no regrets, right? Or regrets. I'm just gonna, turn it to channel fodder and move on with my life. But the solo I found was just never a solo that I'm gonna pick first. This game is wonderful with a group, but there are other people in my gaming group who have it. So I'm probably going to offload my copy of Ultimate Railroads at some point in the future. And that breaks my heart because I really, really like the game itself and am down to play it anytime. But also Russian Railroads is on BGA. And there are people in my group who have this game. It's a huge, box. And the solo just, for me, wasn't really that good. So that's where I'm personally at on it. I'm sure there are people who disagree with me, but hey, it's my channel. You wanted my opinion. There you go. So I'm really sorry that I ended up not liking this one very much. I think that, this is just a consequence of, times changing and expectations of solo modes being higher. I think that if I'd played this solo mode in 2016, when I was first getting really serious about solo games, it would have seemed really fresh, and now it doesn't. So, your mileage may vary. If you have a game group to play with, I actually really, really recommend this game still, because it's fantastic as a game. But the solo is pretty lackluster, or at least that's how I feel about it. So thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, support me on Patreon if you're feeling extra generous. And most of all, happy gaming.